Okay, everybody, I invite any comments from those virtual attendees as well as we go into this. As I said to you at the start, we are very much in the early stages of this project, and we're looking to gain as many ideas as possible about what our future research agenda might be, and also perhaps beginning to have some thoughts about how the online resource might help us study the Privy Council in the future. And not just the Privy Council, of course, but the history of the period of the project in general terms. And I was struck by a very helpful call for papers, which Alan MacDonald did when we were sending out to you all and asking you all to participate, where he listed a number of potential themes that we could look at. And if I just read some of these out to you, it might strike a chord with you, and then we'll kind of open things up for general comments by everybody. The Privy Council and Parliament. Now, the relationship between the institutions, which is what John was talking about, and indeed we've all been talking about it, have we not? And the significance of the project engaging with the Parliamentary Historical Group, which I've mentioned in the past. So was it Robbie who mentioned at some point that perhaps the Privy Council was more representative than the Parliament was? You might keep that idea to yourself in certain quarters. Anyway, the Privy Council and the monarchy, which is a rather obvious idea, but I mean, what extent do we ever believe that the council has its own agenda? Is it always at the behest of the monarch, simply because they've taken the oath of allegiance, or whatever it might be? The standard approach to considering what the council does is that it is designed to implement acts of Parliament in its relationship with Parliament. It makes sure that policy is carried out, on the one hand, but also acting independently in many other areas, and we have to look at that side of things. Enforcement. Interactions between centre and localities. We've talked about how Suzanne talked about this a bit, the notion of the connection with ordinary people, and perhaps the surprising evidence of people at relatively low status finding a way, navigating something, what we don't quite know, to engage with the council. The Privy Council as a vehicle for social control. What evidence is there of some kind of agenda? It sounds as if, as far as religion is concerned, wasn't much fussed a lot of the time. So maybe morally, perhaps the morality of the council was at the behest of the individual members, whose morality would be, well, what shall we say, variable. Minorities and marginal groups. Women, a marginalised group, perhaps. Other marginalised groups, foreigners, migrants, I don't know. The judicial role of the council. Alan Kennedy was talking about this. This seems a whole world on its own in some respects. Anyway, the church, communication and control of information. Julian was talking about this. The economic and regulatory role. The famines of the 1690s, controlling imports and exports, price controls, mercantilism, all these things had that impact. And all of this before we get to the political or purely political role of the council. Or, of course, everything I've said is political, is it not? So, anyway, anybody care to come in with something? I have a few other things that I could say, but I think I've talked enough to introduce this.
About like migration, the movement of people in and out of the country, you know, like the largest migration of Scots to Ulster is in the 1690s, 41 to 44,000. You know, people who are leaving, or maybe, you know, controlling people who are coming into the country, and in the era when you've got the 9 Years' War, assassination plots, etc.
Well, one of the curious things, sometimes as historians we mention a case study as if it's special, and it often isn't. You know, I mean, for example, in my talk that I did last week at the Athens affair from Mount Olympus, I mentioned 6 widows of English soldiers, killie-cranky soldiers who had died, and they were asking for help in July 1689, as if this was something new or unique.
I was standing there earlier
Hello?
when I was looking at you.
Sorry?
Charlotte, can you mute yourself?
And then jumping around and it like dried up like I shouldn't drop.
Callum, you mute yourself. Sorry. But actually it happened for the next year that these soldiers' widows were wanting help. It's a regular account. And I could see, I haven't looked at this in detail, John, but it looked rather on a randomised basis. So the fact that you say there was a deliberate plan in 1689-90, like there was in the 1640s, is something I have yet to find, but I might be wrong. So these are okay, but it just said, oh, find some money. It was that kind of thing.
I think that's a good note. Again, I think it depends on the context, because the context with the Privy Council in 1642 and the context of the Privy Council of 1689 is specifically about Ireland. It's specifically about that issue. But one of the things that's, as far as I can remember, is quite difficult is that locating financial accounts for how many people did come back, how much money, where's the money, follow the money, where's the audit, where's the paper trail, and that's.
So you're suggesting that there was, what was copied was the Irish aspect of this.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas I was talking about English war widows, but well, maybe it is different. Sorry.
No, just to comment on that, I found Scots-Dutch war widows in the same sort of contexts, and I think I don't know if there's necessarily a plan, but there's certainly the council weighing in to give money for repatriation, and this is also related to the Battle of Killiecrankie as well.
Okay, that's
It's also quite interesting, because even when we got to the war in Ireland, and all these Ulster Scots come back, and well, they hit everywhere, but you know, they hit Ayrshire. I think one of the groups are like Presbyterian ministers, so they get parishes here in Scotland where Episcopalians have been purged.
Yeah.
But after, you know, the places in Antrim and Down in the 1690s, I said, we want them back, get back over here, and they won't go. But with regard to like the Ulster Scots who come back, they're raising arms in Ayrshire, etc. The regime in Edinburgh that wants them out. You know, okay, we'll help you, but time to go home.
Yeah.
We don't really want you around here.
It's the same in the Scots-Dutch context. It's money to repatriate the women and the children after the soldiers have died.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they are weighing in. I don't know if there's necessarily a framework or any precedents for that?
Well, the whole basis on which these English widows are helped is the basis of them going back to England.
I
I mean, they're given some money so they can feed their families, because they come up with their children.
Yeah.
As the Irish train, I suppose we would call it, wouldn't we? But they are to go away. I mean, it's not as if they're going to be, you know, claiming off parishes in the future or something like that. That's not an expectation.
Shameless self-plug, if you want to go on the Scotland, Northern European, Scandinavian database, I've got the widows on there.
All right.
So if
Excellent.
anyone wants to read them.
Sorry, I just see Gillian has her hand raised. So Gillian, if you want to come in on this, please do.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Can everybody hear me / see me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so jumping off of both of what John said, Alistair said, and what Graham said. Okay, there is this. What about the use of political theory when you start talking about the Privy Council? Because actually, what I've found in talking about refugees and war widows and people that are being repatriated, which is actually the last chapters of my dissertation. And Keith mentioned this earlier about borrowing things from other areas. The Privy Council actually put international relations theory into practice. So moving forward, would it be worth talking about international refugee and migration theory to work through these sort of things as well? Because, and shameless self-plug, I've actually written a paper on the framework that they use for repatriating widows of sailors and of the widows from Killiecrankie as well. So it was just a thought in that direction.
Send us the text. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's I mean, one of the things that John discussed was foreign policy aspects in general terms, and I think that is a major area to interrogate.
Another thing that this links into, though, is perhaps communication. Certainly, John's case of the war widows from Ireland in the early 1640s, from what I can remember, there's a lot of gathering of money by the Privy Council, but from the presbyteries.
Yes.
And so, the Privy Council just isn't sitting on a pot of money.
No.
I'm guessing, that it can just disperse. And I wonder if a similar thing is happening in the 1690s or 1689-90, that sort of period, in terms of the Privy Council as a sort of national coordinator of relief and repatriation. And it's about communication, it's about humanitarian ventures, it's about multiple aspects and themes of how the Privy Council works and what its role is and its relationship to other administrative.
It facilitates action sometimes. Yeah. Well, presumably it gives it. Well, it's interesting how often, Privy Council warrant in inverted commas allows something to happen. Is it okay if we do this? It doesn't involve any cost by the council. It just says yes, you can go ahead and do it. So yeah, I mean that could be anything from local raising of money to repair a bridge to anything else. Okay, yeah, that's right. No, I get that.
Yeah, but I could come in here. Quite often we're talking about money.
Yeah.
Have we noticed? And where that money comes from, where it goes to, who controls it, who's got the power to raise money, right from the first paper about state formation. This is a period when new taxes are being devised, and it's a period where sort of new wars are being fought, where these taxes come from, where the pressure points are, how you assess those taxes, what's the effective way of actually accessing people's resources. You've sort of got experimental things like the hearth tax, which never gets anywhere, the poll taxes, there are several of those. but the sort of bread and butter is still the sort of land tax or whatever we call it. It's the cess. Excise is another one. How far the Privy Council is involved in those things is. I mean, offhand, I'm not sure, but my impression is that it will be involved in the the administration of how that money is collected, how the system that collects it gets controlled and supervised, and to some extent, then how it's spent. But looking at the gathering of that money, and then I think credit was mentioned earlier all the months. That is just such a crucial aspect of the state, and it's of particular interest in historiography as this period.
Just to add to that as well, I think from a quick glance through some of the manuscripts from the 1690s, I do actually think there does seem to be slightly more mention of supervising tax collectors or that kind of thing in our period in the 1690s than I noticed from the earlier phases of the Privy Council registers. This might actually be an aspect of the Privy Council's activity that is intensifying in the 1690s. But I say that's just impression from a quick look at the manuscripts, but it's certainly something we should.
Is this an intensification that follows the same graph as the state of the economy as it gets worse and worse? The efforts on increasing to try and raise them.
Yeah, those are the kind of questions. Yeah.
If I could just comment on that, it could also be related to the internal war effort.
Yes, of course.
Related to the wider European.
Quite so.
That was the second institution you worked on, it disappeared. Are you forming a sort of view of why it disappears? Is it because we're hearing
because it's associated with me, is that
yes, there's a mixed narrative to be, isn't there? That it's a kind of slightly bumbling amatory group of people who occasionally get interested in something, or it's pretty effective at a lot of what it does. It's early days yet. I mean, you're getting to a sense of, well, they get rid of it because it was just too good at its job, or they get rid of it because it was irrelevant, or what?
Well, it's easy to be deterministic about this, isn't it? But I mean, it's a curious one, isn't it? I mean, it suffers from the same Whiggish baggage that Parliament does, in the sense that, it was ineffective, therefore why, who cares if it was abolished, that kind of argument. But the argument about the ineffectiveness against Jacobitism after it was abolished would suggest that it could have done something about that. But that's speculation, isn't it? We don't know. Actually, I think it's surprising that there wasn't more of an effort made amongst the Scottish political classes to retain it in 1708. That's the surprise. I mean, even though, the argument from the opposition in Scottish politics was that it was merely a vehicle for the government of the day to dominate. But it could be a vehicle that they could dominate one day, so you'd think they would be a bit more up for keeping it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me to be more of an exercise in tidying up. But if it was ineffective, you need to replace it with something, and the fact that you didn't really replace it with anything, if the argument that it's ineffective carries, then that's why they did it. The fact that nothing was put in its place, and arguably, again, if it's Jacobitism, the 1715 Rising didn't really have anything on the ground to respond to it, and that was a bit of an empty space in planning, in a sense. So I don't think that really stacks up, and Keith's sort of characterisation of it as either effective or a bunch of bumbling amateurs. But that's a really interesting one, because fundamentally, depending on our political viewpoints, that's how we regard any government. There are plenty of us in this room who at any given time will regard the government as a bunch of bumbling idiots, or as a bunch of people whose heart's really in the right place and we ought to support them, depending on our own personal inclinations and which government we're talking about.
Yeah, the difference though is that we're not, if the government of the day is a group of bumbling idiots, we're not normally suggesting that we get rid of the whole institution.
No,
What we're looking to do is reform, okay, change the government, change the rules, but have some rules, etc. So that is a slightly different argument, I think. I mentioned the idea of tidying up.
why I don't think it's a slightly different argument, because I'm merely saying that's how we characterise things about whether we like them or not. We say this or that about them. But I think I don't think that's why they got rid of it.
All right.
But what I'm saying is that that can't be the explanation for why they got rid of it.
No, I agree with that.
And actually, it's about, presumably, they felt, well, we've now got one parliament and therefore one legislature. Why do we have two executives? That doesn't really make sense.
Can I just jump in here? Because one thing that I found surprising when I started looking through the Acta and Decreta, taking all those photographs, is that actually the Privy Council's business, there's a tendency to think that 1708 happens because of 17%, that's the union and the tidying up thing, but actually the Privy Council's business seems to be beginning to dry up from about 1705. There's far less in the record in the couple of years before the union. And I don't think that's just record loss. It looks like there's just less being recorded. So I don't know if there's maybe a slightly deeper pre-union explanation to the abolition in 1708 than we realise. I don't know, it's just from looking at the volume of the record. Sorry.
So one of the ways, I don't know either, but one of the ways in which this question, it's a very interesting question, could actually be tackled, sort of relating to some of the papers that we've heard, is looking at how people used the council, so the private business. Yeah? People who would who petitioned the council in the 1690s. After 1608, where did they go? What was your redress mechanism? Was there something useful that had been taken away? I mean, this is one of the ways in which the sort of theorists of law look at law. Law provides remedies and mechanisms that allows you to do things. And government is a way of putting that into practice. So is this an instance of state unformation, if we can quote where there is, rather surprisingly for an early modernist like me, there's suddenly is less government overall, and people are told what to do less often than they were before. Intuitively, I find that slightly unlikely, but it's not impossible, right? But the way to answer it would be where do those people go? And then similarly with the public business, you want an army raised and sent to this, that, or the other place. How do you do it? And you discover suddenly that you can't anymore. And the comparative studies that of the different Jacobite uprisings, might reveal something.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting, and it's a question that I've often thought of with regard to Parliament too, because having worked on the boroughs in particular, a borough wants something. And it goes to Parliament, often via the convention, but nevertheless it goes to Parliament and gets it relatively easily, because it's got a commissioner there. After 1707, it might not even have a commissioner there, because it's sharing a commissioner with 5 or 6 other boroughs, and the place that it needs to go to is like at least 400 miles away. Whereas previously it was much more handy. There was much more regular contact. So just like with the Privy Council, where do these guys go to get the outcomes? It's one of those things that I've always felt it's a question that's, as far as I know, has never been addressed about the transition of Scotland into Britain. How do the people who are used to being Scottish and then have to become British deal with that fact that they can't go to Edinburgh to get these things anymore, they need to go to London, or what routes do they find?
At elite level, you can still do it. I mean, if Edinburgh wants to get whatever, it can get an Act of Parliament in London to deal with the Edinburgh thing.
It's more time consuming.
Yeah, it is. But certainly, if you're at, say, parish level or smaller borough level, what do you do? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, unless you approach a member of Parliament and say,
do you have any idea of the quantity of business that people took to Parliament in London? And was it only elites like Edward I, you peeled down there? I have no idea what happened.
My impression, I mean, certainly in comparison to the Scottish Parliament, the normality of the kind of ordinary stuff that you get in the Scottish Parliament in the early modern period just isn't there in the English Parliament. The ordinary local permissions and things like that are much, much less common, and I get the impression from reading on the issue that it's because it's much more expensive to do this, and maybe there are other local ways of sorting that out, but you don't, the English Parliament doesn't tend to do that kind of business for English localities in the way that the Scottish Parliament does it for Scottish localities. So what I'm saying here, I suppose, is if a Scottish local representative went down to England and said, can I have this? They'd go, what the hell are you asking us for? You don't do that.
So in fact, are more of these things perhaps done locally in the way that it would be done within an English county, possibly?
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, I have a sense that this could be done in a sort of comparative way just by looking at geographical distance. I mean, one sort of simple thing is, okay, it's a long way from Edinburgh to London. It's, from Newcastle to London, it's not that much less far. So, how much of a problem is it if you live in Newcastle? Even before 1707. And similarly, actually, if you live in Dornoch or Wick, Edinburgh is not all that close.
Yeah.
And you wrote about the 5 boroughs, but if you'd written about the Caithness and Sutherland boroughs,
I don't think there would have been much to say.
But in theory, you should be able to map it and see a sort of intensity of government falling off with distance, if that's what the driver is. If it's distance, you ought to see a gradation, both in Scotland and in England.
Just playing with your thing about deformation of the state. You take the council out. What got put in? Was it just the excise money? Was that the only addition to this administrative infrastructure after 1707?
The Lord Advocate's office gets bigger, perhaps.
Yeah. Because business must have gone somewhere.
Conventional boroughs?
I think
it's already.
It's on its nose diving, isn't it?
I think the Lord Advocate is already taking on more business, even before 1707. Try to stop me on witchcraft. But, the Privy Council is a sort of standard source for getting commissions of justiciary on witchcraft, and we've had papers that talk about that. But I think even before 1708, I see local authorities in the 1690s, 1700s. They're not going to the Privy Council to get a commission. They're going to the Lord Advocate, and it's the Lord Advocate's personal decision. In fact, often it's Stuart of Gutters, who we've heard about. It's his personal decision to grant a commission or not, even before 1708. And so this could be seen as sort of departmentalisation instead of the Privy Council as an institution. We're looking at the Lord Advocate and his department as an institution. Just a hypothesis.
Well, maybe we'll find that quorums become a problem towards the final couple of years, and that the problem is that the Privy Councillors stop turning up. Because
it's less useful.
Because there's a special professional who's doing it. In other words,
Somebody must have decided that the Lord Advocate should do it.
Well,
not necessarily. They might just discover that it works.
Sorry, Suzanne, go on.
I was just going to say there was a case I was looking at, and it was an infanticide case from about the 1740s, I think it was. I need to look at it in more detail now. But the lawyer was in court on the defence of this woman, and he made this big long speech in his defence about how the Privy Council was gone now, and these women didn't have that access to help them with their defence and commuting their sentences. And he sort of made the point that now the lawyers were stepping up a wee bit into that position and providing these women with a defence in court. So I'll go back to that and have a look.
So you're saying, so instead of appealing in judicial cases, instead of appealing to the Privy Council, they were represented by lawyers in their cases.
Yeah,
okay.
Who were bringing.
Well, that's a kind of, so maybe it's the professionalisation of society that's having an impact on the Privy Council.
But that takes us back to Alan's paper, doesn't it? When he observed that you've got an increasing role for the Lord Advocate in the Restoration period in bringing prosecutions, which is, it looks more like, I don't want to exaggerate it too much, but it looks more like the development of the Crown Office. in the sense that,
That's been a trajectory since the late 16th century.
Yeah.
Yes, it has.
and so that proportionate change of Lord Advocate being A, involved, and B, the primary mover in prosecutions through the period you looked at, you know, draw the graph and that line ends up where Julian was just talking about, arguably.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could project this back in time as well. I don't know where Amy Blakeway and Mark Godfrey have got to on the origins of the Privy Council. I mean, the way I tend to think of the origins of the Privy Council isn't that people sit down and say, we're going to create a new institution, we're going to build a state or something, you know, in 1545 or at any other date. What tends to happen is that you've got these guys talking to each other and somebody goes, is anybody minuting this? You know, once you start minuting things, you know, you've got potential to actually, you know, record decisions which can then be pointed to and used. And you discover that works. So the Privy Council is a success story, not because people decided it was going to be a success story and it lasts for 100 and however many years, but it just so happens that it worked for that long. Whereas the Committee for Grievances of the 1620s, you know, only last for a few weeks or something. And you know, there are plenty of other governmental initiatives that don't get very far. But well, that one happens to work, and the Lord Advocate simply.
But on that basis, you would expect the English Privy Council to suffer from the same issues. That I don't know, but you would assume that its business would be declining as well, as it. I mean, I don't know, because maybe this doesn't fit in with the centralised nature of the English state, of course. But the idea that there's less business, more professionalisation.
Multi-compartmentalisation.
Yeah, it means that it's doing less. But I don't know if that's the case, and I'm hoping that some English historians can help us with that.
Yeah, there probably will be, but I think you'll find that there'll be more specialisation, so more things will be done by the Treasury, and the Board of Trade, etc., that would have previously been done by a unitary Privy Council. And so the Privy Council is sort of, I think it still exists, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. There are over 700 Privy Councillors at the moment.
Yeah.
If they all gather, when the Queen pops her clogs, they all get together and produce an invitation to Charles. So yeah, they don't all turn up, but you know, and of course they're led by the esteemed Rees-Mogg. So
it's, you know, it's a sort of residual thing, but it gets reinvented every time there's a new thing comes on. The old one starts looking different.
And you get the emergence of something more like cabinet in the early 18th century, don't you? Yeah. Said on the basis of extreme ignorance, but I've got a feeling that, so in that process, first of all, the English Privy Council doesn't have the judicial power that the Scottish one has in the first place.
That's right.
Because of Star Chamber, earlier on anyway. And then secondly, in the early 18th century, something like the cabinet's emerging. So actually that is the decline of the English Privy Council too, arguably.
That's right.
Who does the Lord Advocate report to?
Before 1707,
I mean, presumably before must have been Privy Council.
Okay.
After that, who is his boss?
Would he? Originally, it would have been the Secretary of State, but then when he's not around, because it comes and goes, doesn't it? It must be the Prime Minister. It must be the government in London.
Well, it would be then.
So does he sit on the English Privy Council?
I don't think he does, because there are very few Scottish members in the 18th century, actually.
But it's probably the informal network you're particularly interested in, so the Isla or something.
This is alarming, isn't it? I mean, there's so many questions we don't know the answers to. I think we should send the money back to Labour. Right?
Well, the good thing is, Alice, a lot of these questions were the 18th century, so we can ignore them.
Yeah, we can ignore them. That's right.
Yes, just a viewpoint about the volume of business, though, which I think is a really interesting one to explore. But is it volume in relation to the immediate preceding period? Because you could think, actually, the 1690s was pretty hyperactive. You've got a revolution, you've got balls up in Darien, you've got, you know, anti-English stuff with Captain Green and all this. So it's a fairly busy period. Maybe it just gets a bit quieter after.
Well, I mean, possibly,
the
Privy Council business was fairly substantial in this restoration as well, so it's not like it's gone from we'll do nothing for 30 years and suddenly we do loads and loads in the 1690s and then we do nothing again. If it is a sort of reversion to a mean. It's a mean that was a very long way in the past.
That's important.
I think it also matters that Parliament met more often as well. That can make a difference, actually. I mean, the last few years, for longer periods of time. Whereas the restoration, you know, you get certainly a number of 2 or 3 years when it doesn't meet at all.
I mean, that could be the case that it's just the union debate being conducted in Parliament is sucking the oxygen out of it. I don't know, it's just a...
So how many years funding have you got?
3. We won't get 10. We won't get 10.
Where's Michael Forsyth when you need it?
That's right. Anyway, anybody else? We've done really well, but anybody else have any further points that they want to mention before we wrap up?
Well, another thread that's run through a lot of this is actually law and sort of technical legal history and sometimes black letter stuff, and stuff that get the usage voting law, stuff written in Latin and so on. And some of that legal theory I think will be relevant to some of what you do. Yeah.
Is there anybody virtually wanting to ask a question or say something?
It's all quiet on the chat. If anyone
Callum is still there.
But if anyone has any insights,
He wants me to see his next chapter, so he's not going away yet. So good. Nobody else?
One thing, sorry,
Robbie,
I've seen
go
a
on.
bit of, like in miscellaneous boxes and just from going through to create an actor, like kind of dipping in and out, is kind of improvement, I guess, agricultural improvement, industrial improvement. Like there's a case which hopefully I'll look at again on Monday in the NRS about this, I can't remember his name, George Mayer, who was involved in the salt industry in Denmark. Or no, wait. I think it was somewhere in Scandinavia, and basically there's a bond of caution for him not to travel back. Was it Sweden? You're probably looking at it as well. For him not to travel back, but to practice like his salt making practices in Scotland. And there were some other matters to do with the coal industry and improvements made in, I can't remember where it was, I was looking at it earlier. Improvements made some places in the lowlands, like draining of locks and things like this, and engines being implemented. So I think that's something that's not really been spoken about today. But
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, although there is a continuum, the Privy Council gets involved in this stuff from the restoration onwards, but certainly it does build. That's right. There's a period there's a lot of patents, monopolies that are given out by the Privy Council in the 1670s, 1680s period as well. So that's interesting too.
Yeah, Parliament, the 1690s as well. We think through the later sessions of 1698 to 1701. The focus there is all about the Company of Scotland, Darien, whatever. But there's loads of other stuff going on in those sessions, like petitions and supplications. But it's on those types of themes, and they seem quite confident.
Well,
entrepreneurs, London Scots want to come back home, set up businesses, bring in foreign labour. I don't get the sense of like doom and gloom. And you mentioned there engines. I think it's a mathematician. He's looking for the parliamentary approval because he's invented an engine for extracting water, and that will help develop the coal industry. It's really fascinating stuff.
And in that same sense of like labour relations, obviously like colliers and salters were serfs until like 1799 or something like that. Perhaps it'd be something in the Privy Council records about labour relations between coal and salt kind of owners and the workers.
Well, again, it's finding out who are these, five layers who've got coal mines, etc. So salt pans and so on. So there's a whole kind of what are the interests of the individuals. I mean, it's interesting about improvement. I mean, one of the reasons why the council might, if the work dries up to some extent, is they all go back to their estates because they've got to do something with them. And there could be an element of that going on. In the age of improvement, say, they're all thinking, actually, that's a waste of time. I need to concentrate on developing my agricultural land. So there'll be some with those sorts of reasons. And there will be people stuck down to London as well, of course.
Kind
There's a
of
few.
along this, sorry, kind of along the same themes of improvement is the proposals to modernise the military, because when William takes control of the government of Scotland, the equipment's really outdated, and you get guys like John Slessor who draw up proposals to bring in particularly skilled artillerymen and people who can forge cannons and guns from Europe, particularly from Germany and the Netherlands, to upgrade Scotland and give it its own arsenal. And that very much that quickly falls by the wayside, because the Highland War concludes as he draws up the proposal, and it's just kind of forgotten about. So it's maybe there's some proposals that I
How would
really
that
want to
apply,
get.
what Alistair mentioned earlier? But surely the role of Scotland in European warfare, and the role of the Privy Council and that. That's huge, isn't it?
No,
There's the warrants to recruit for the brigade afterwards, which expands. I mean, you get some amount of, like the Camerons even, who are up against William, who are joining the Scots Dutch Brigade, and they're being given warrants through the council, I think.
But there's quite a lot of international themes. The Königsberg example that I gave in my talk last week, you know, the Scottish expats there petitioned the Privy Council for there to be a collection amongst the parishes of Scotland so they could build a new church there. I mean, that kind of thing, that's international relations, isn't it? It's looking after a community abroad. So there's quite a large number of foreign policy themes actually that we can look at. Dear me.
Something I've often wondered, and it does come up throughout the earlier period, at least I don't know about the later period, is talking of international connections, is these poor people who are taken by the Turks. And you think, how on earth does that work? I mean, God, you know, you collect all that money to pay the ransom of the Turks. Where the hell are the Turks for a start? And how on earth do you find them? I mean,
Can you say that these days?
to ransom these people. I mean, because the Turks is obviously just a generic.
I couldn't understand why there are all these Dundee United supporters all over the place. Oh, there are. Sorry.
Why it's just a generic? It's obviously just a generic term for Muslims.
It's Algiers.
Yeah, of course.
But how? You know, what are the connections? What are the, I mean,
who's the go-between? I mean,
exactly. That's what I'm saying. I mean, we can work it out with Ireland relatively easily because we can trace these connections. But the connections, not just to the continent of Europe, but all the way to Africa. I mean,
it is incredible. No, I agree with that.
It's got Tangier. I forget the dates. You know, it's actually a sort of outpost of the English military outpost, and it's to deal with that problem. I think.
It'll be interesting to see how much the Scots are tapping into that.
But then doesn't Tangier fall in 1680?
Does it not fall in the 1670s?
Yeah, I can't remember.
I thought it was 1670.
Yeah, it was set off to go.
I think James gave, when he was Duke of York, I can't remember, some Scottish noble, can't remember his bloody name now, Hay or something, becomes Tangier guy, and then, you know, he loses it all of a sudden. That's it, 1670, 72, 73, something. Yeah. Anyway, shall we wrap it up then? I think we should. Listen, thank you all so much. Let me give you an invitation, and the virtuals as well, for next year's workshop in Dundee, which Claire and I will be mightily relieved it's not us that's running it this time. And I hope that the quality of the lunch, as well as the quality of the arguments, are just as good there as they were today. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.